Hey folks, I'm Darius Spearman. Thank you for joining me this evening for African Elements. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk on the Scottsboro 9, the NAACP, and the Communist Party. And I'm going to focus on the Scottsboro trial and why the Communist Party was better situated to jump in and why the NAACP was a bit tepid about getting involved. So I'll be on for about a half an hour. I'll take the last 10 minutes or so to address questions, not just on this live stream, but also on the premiere, which hopefully you had a chance to check out just before this live stream. If you didn't, maybe check it out afterward. The link is below in the description. So I'm also going to talk about, in spite of the rivalry between the Communist Party and the civil rights organizations like the NAACP, the Communist Party's involvement in the Scottsboro case led to some of the future civil rights victories. I mentioned that in the premiere, but I didn't go into detail. So I'm going to give a couple of specific examples here in this live stream. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the shortcomings and limitations of both approaches, those of the Communist Party and the NAACP. So I ended the last premiere with a question, and I hope to continue that discussion tonight as well, about reform, which is more where the NAACP was, changing the laws, et cetera, and the Communist Party, which is more about radical transformation. There are some advantages and shortcomings to both of those approaches. And I want to have a discussion because honestly, I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't see it as my role to tell people this is the approach that you should take. And I do the same thing with my students in my classroom. What I'm trying to do is help folks understand these are the limitations of the approach that you're taking. As long as you're okay living within those limitations, then go for it. Or maybe you can mitigate some of those limitations. So again, I don't have a good answer to that question. So this is something that hopefully we can have some conversation about. If you're feeling generous tonight, super chats are enabled, and those comments and questions will of course go to the front of the line. If you're feeling, oops, actually, there we go. There they are. So if you're feeling even more generous tonight, you might consider joining some of these folks down below here. These are the Patreon subscribers, and I want to give a huge thanks to our Patreon subscribers for your donations every month. Your support's helped up the quality of these videos, and it means the world to me. If you want to see where that support is going, check out some of my earlier videos, and you'll see where the quality was then versus now. So if you want to join them, the link is in the description below. We do have for Patreon subscribers at just $1 a month, at just $1 a month level, you'll have access to ad-free videos, as well as various membership tiers where you can get access to PowerPoints and even full course shells. And I'm going to be updating those tiers fairly soon. So let's jump in. Let's see. And I'm going to start with oops, let me get there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start with just a brief sort of background on what the Scottsboro trial was and how the Communist Party got involved in it. So in Scottsboro, Alabama, this started when 9 Black teenagers were falsely accused and convicted of rape in 1931. This is at the time of the Depression. These were unemployed Black hobos, just like many people who were jumping on trains, moving from town to town, looking for work. And so these teenagers, ranging in age from I think 12 or 13 to 19, were basically accused of raping 2 white women on a boxcar, an open boxcar, in full view of everybody, and having made no attempt to escape, and no witnesses had seen this event taking place. Nevertheless, the trial lasted less than 2 days, and an all-white jury took just over an hour to deliberate and find them guilty. The case actually was a major landmark in the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, even though the NAACP was kind of tepid in its involvement, didn't want to get involved in this case for reasons that I'll talk about. And again, that goes to one of the shortcomings of that approach. Whereas the Communist Party in the United States at that time was very active in Black communities, were very quick to respond, and had secured legal counsel for the 9 teenagers that had just been convicted of rape. And upon doing that, had effected an overturn of the verdict in a precedent-setting case, which is going to reverberate throughout the civil rights era, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the precedents that was set in this case was the right to adequate counsel. And basically these teenagers were represented by, I think, a real estate attorney, and with just some money that they'd scraped together on the fly. And the Communist Party had argued that they were so inadequately represented that the trial should be thrown out. And in a precedent-setting case, that conviction was overturned. So the Communist Party at that point had secured control over the defense. Now, the Communist Party had been active in Black communities from at least the 1920s up to World War II. And it was organized on the basis of worker solidarity and interracial unity under the theory that poor whites shared the same capitalist oppressor and held a common interest with Blacks. It was a foreign-based organization, which at the time of the Red Scare in the United States and the Palmer raids, and you know, we had a bunch of socialists, a bunch of communists, a bunch of anarchists in the wake of World War I in the United States, and there was a very deliberate propaganda campaign initiated by the sort of newly initiated FBI office at that time that these folks were a threat, that these foreigners couldn't be trusted, and these communists were out to get us in our sleep. So for that reason, a lot of Black folks held the Communist Party at arm's length, simply because they didn't want to be associated with, they didn't want to basically another target on their back, because the communists and the anarchists and the socialists were being actively targeted by the FBI at that time, especially in the early 1920s. But the Communist Party was very aggressive in terms of reaching out to the Black community. They saw a Black and white worker solidarity, if they could get that going, they saw that as a major vehicle, especially when the Great Depression hit and people were hurting and people were being exploited, as we saw in the last video. They saw that as an opportunity to gain inroads, not just with Black folks, but with poor whites, and create more worker solidarity, which was kind of their thing. So because of that, the Communist Party, African Americans in the Communist Party were represented disproportionately in leadership positions compared to their membership. The Communist Party actively sought to put Black folks in leadership positions, was explicitly anti-racist, which was the main problem. With the problem wasn't they were anti-racist, but the hurdle that they had to get over in bringing Black and white workers together was racism. So they were very explicit in attacking racism to the point of expelling racist members. They would actually hold these hearings if somebody was accused of racism, where they would have to defend that they were not racist, otherwise be expelled from the party. So even as aggressive as they were in terms of reaching out to the Black community, it had relatively low membership among Blacks, even though a lot of Black folks, as we saw in the previous premiere, were very sympathetic to their ideas. I think there was a lot of fear that Black folks being associated with the Communist Party. Again, because I don't think they think they probably didn't want another target on their backs. So the Communist Party had been organizing in the South since the early 1920s, at least, bringing together Black and white farm workers, which was very, very dangerous work. Probably the best historical work on that was a book by Robin Kelly, an excellent historian, called Hammer and Hoe. I should probably put that in the description below. But it's a really good read, excellent read. I highly recommend it. But he's done some great great work in documenting the history of the Communist Party in the southern United States, the work that they were doing, the danger that it involved. And that was partly the reason why the NAACP sort of held them at arm's length. There was a lot of rivalry, excuse me, between the NAACP and the Communist Party. And that had to do with some of the limitations and problems that the NAACP had. The NAACP tended to be, they operated, their platform was integration and inclusion into the United States. And they were, again, very much reformist. Their main thrust was changing the laws. And they were effective at that. That, of course, came with a different set of problems. But I mean, of course, probably they're most recognized for the Brown versus Board of Education lawsuit in 1954, which in theory, at least, made segregation in public institutions unconstitutional. Of course, theory and practice is going to be, it's going to take a while before practice catches up with theory. I think there was a 2004 report by the Harvard Civil Rights Project to commemorate 50 years since Brown versus Board of Education, and that report found that schools were just as segregated in 2004 as they had been in 1967. So putting it into practice is one of the problems and challenges that the NAACP has, because there's always another law, right? Okay, we can't, it's almost like kids. If you tell kids you can't do something, they'll find a way to say, well, you didn't say I couldn't do this, right? So the segregation, the white supremacist structure of segregation was very resilient in terms of finding ways to creatively draw districts, for example, and to ensure that segregation persisted. So that was part of the problem. And again, you would think that this being a case, a court case, that this would be right up the NAACP's alley. Right, they're very legalistic minded. They tended to be very legalistic minded. One of their first, plans. One of the first things that they attacked was the grandfather clause, which had kept a lot of Black folks from voting in Gwynn versus United States in 1915, and right up through, Smith versus Allwright, Brown versus Board of Education. That kind of had been their thing. But they did have a problem because they were also had, as part of their agenda, were looking for inclusion, were looking for integration. And in making the case for integration, they oftentimes tended to not pay too much attention to the Black working class, and was tended to be hesitant to intervene in cases that might make Black folks look bad. So they were very much this sort of 200% American, right? To prove that they were worthy of inclusion. And you could see why they would be hesitant to jump into a case involving 9 unemployed Black hobos who were accused of raping 2 white women. So the NAACP didn't necessarily want to jump in. Of course, that's right up the Communist Party's alley, right? They have no problem working with the poor and working class. So that was not something that they were skittish at all about. The other piece of this rivalry between the Communist Party and the NAACP, again, going back to that 200% American sort of ideology, the Communist Party, again, at that point, along with the socialists, anarchists, et cetera, this wave of migrants that had come over after World War I, was seen as a threat, again, because of the Red Scare, the Palmer raids, et cetera, that had taken place earlier in the decade, in the 1920s. The Communist Party had been seen as un-American, and in large part it was directed out of Moscow, which was both a sort of plus and a minus. So you can see why the NAACP wouldn't want anything to do with these poor Black hobos accused of raping 2 white women, nor would they want to be in any way associated with a group that was seen as un-American. right? So that's a big part of why there was that rivalry. And it also had to do, because they had very different approaches, it also had to do with why the NAACP was not as well suited for this particular case as the Communist Party was, again, because they had no problem working with poor, working class, unemployed hobos in the Black community. And so they saw this as an opportunity to again, reach out to Black folks to create that worker solidarity. So again, in terms of the NAACP's sort of ideological problem, again, most of you know who Rosa Parks is in the middle here, who was arrested for not giving up her seat in 1955. Some of you, I'm sure, know who Claudette Colvin is on the left here. She was also arrested in 1955 for not giving up her seat. The NAACP, again, chose not to pursue that case, again, because they were very conscious and aware of image and how this might make the Black community look. And so they deemed Claudette Colvin, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, not necessarily the best person to put forward in a case that might gain national attention because she had become an unwed teen mother shortly thereafter. Some of you might even know who this person on the right is as well. That's Mary Louise Smith. And probably fewer people know who she was. But Mary Louise Smith, kind of the same thing. The NAACP kind of stayed away from that case, not because of anything she did, but because her father was reported to be an alcoholic. So again, that's one of the weaknesses and limitations of that ideology. If you're looking for inclusion and you're looking to put your best face forward, you have to be selective about which cases you pursue. And again, you have to make some decisions about if that's a limitation that you're willing to live with, right? I mean, I get why they did it, but it certainly is a limitation. So again, I'll leave that to you if that's something that, again, that you're willing to, if that's a limitation that you're willing to work within. So again, there's open hostility between the NAACP and the Communist Party, and you had just again a quick overview of the case. Well, actually, let me go back to some of the hostility and the tension between the NAACP and the Communist Party. Part of that had to do with the events at Camp Hill, Alabama. The Communist Party, again, was very bold in terms of going to the South, organizing sharecroppers, creating interracial unions in the South. In the 1930s, that was dangerous work. It got people beaten, it got people killed. And that's another part of the rivalry between the NAACP. The NAACP saw the Communist Party as reckless, as you're just going to get Black folks killed, right? So that kind of came to a head, and this is actually one of the reasons why W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the NAACP and also founded The Crisis, which was the NAACP's magazine, eventually left the NAACP. It was largely over this issue and over the Communist Party. In Camp Hill, Alabama, there were some, at the time of the Scottsboro trial, there were some communist organizers that had met in the South to discuss the case with the Croppers and Farmers Workers Union, the CFWU. And at that time, the meeting was raided by basically organized thugs, deputized, vigilantes. And during the raid, both men and women were beaten before the group left and sort of regrouped at the main organizer's home, a guy by the name of Tommy Gray. And these vigilantes, these thugs, also disrupted the meeting there and assaulted his entire family, including his wife, who had suffered a fractured skull. His Tommy's brother, Tommy's brother, Ralph Gray, was also brutally murdered execution style by the police chief, who put a pistol in his mouth. So W.E.B. Du Bois had sort of praised the Communist Party for at least their willingness to put themselves on the line and put their bodies on the line and put themselves in danger. And that led to some tension between the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois, and ultimately he left the NAACP over that issue. We talked a little bit of the background of the case. These are poor hobos who were looking for work, along with many white folks. 9 black teenagers who were accused of raping 2 white women on this boxcar. NAACP, for reasons that I talked about, were tentative, tepid about representing these accused poor black folks of raping a white woman, and of course working with poor black folks. That's right up the Communist Party's alley. So they jumped in without any hesitation, right? So there's a number of things that came out of this trial. Oops, I think there we go. There's a number of things that came out of the trial, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the. I've talked about some of the disadvantages of the Communist Party being a foreign organization, and I'll talk about one more disadvantage. And I want to talk about some of the advantages, why they were particularly suited. Again, ideologically, this is the ideal case for them. They have no problem working with poor folks. That's kind of their thing. But they also had enormous amount of resources, being an internationally based organization. Now, that was a dual-edged sword, because being an internationally based organization based in Moscow, they were seen as un-American. They were targeted. They had a lot of the Scottsboro teenagers themselves, Scottsboro Boys themselves, were subject to a lot of abuse within the prison. I mean, they were targeted for abuse within the prison system with the guards because of the notoriety of the case and the Communist Party. So, in Scottsboro, Alabama, you have an organization that is communist, that the FBI is telling people that, these are folks who are going to, get your children in their sleep. And that didn't sit well, obviously, with the Alabama jury. Now, you could argue that they did a much better job defending them than the previous person who was representing them, who was a real estate attorney. And one of the advantages of the Communist Party is that they had international resources to put into this. Not only did they have a lot of resources within their legal defense fund, who put their full resources into the case, but the advantage, even though it's a dual-edged sword, the advantage to having an international organization put their resources into it is that the Communist Party staged demonstrations in Harlem, but there were also demonstrations worldwide, in Berlin, throughout Europe, in Moscow. So you had the world watching, and that's one of the things that I think saved their lives. Even though the Alabama court system was hostile towards both the Scottsboro Boys and towards the Communist Party, the world was watching this, and they had to make sure that they crossed their T's and dot their I's, and were very conscious of procedure. And that was, I think, one of the things that eventually saved their lives. So that was one advantage. They had a lot of resources to put into this case. They didn't have a problem working with poor working class black folks. Again, ideologically, that's right up their alley. So in a lot of ways, they're ideally situated for this case. And some of again, if the NAACP didn't, they fought like cats and dogs, the NAACP and the Communist Party. But the fact is that there were a lot of things from this trial that the NAACP later benefited from. First, being the right to adequate representation. And again, we talked about how the NAACP is very legalistic minded, tends to use the courts as their primary weapon for attacking Jim Crow, for attacking racism, discrimination, etc. So this precedent that was set in the Scottsboro case, the right to adequate representation, was a huge precedent that the NAACP would later take advantage of. right? So it helped a lot of the NAACP's victories later on. So the first trial, they were in 1931, they were all convicted. The NAACP overturned that verdict because of the precedent, the right to adequate representation. They were tried and convicted again, and they had that sentence overturned. And in Norris versus Alabama, another precedent was sent that would later help the NAACP and the civil rights fight later on. And that was Clarence Norris was one of the Scottsboro Nine, and in the case of Norris versus Alabama, it was determined that he was again convicted, and that was overturned when the Supreme Court found that Black folks had been systematically excluded from the juries, right? And based on that, the verdict was again overturned, and we had the establishment, at least the enforcement, a precedent for enforcement of a right to jury by peers. That was huge in the South. That was going to aid a lot of the civil rights victories later on. So those are some of the things that the NAACP, that the Communist Party did that later benefited the civil rights movement. Let's talk about some of the weaknesses, some of the problems, some of the limitations with the Communist Party. We talked about one, they were seen as anti-American, as un-American. We talked about the other thing that the hurdle that they had to get over was racism. How are you going to organize poor whites and Black folks and bring together some worker solidarity when you have this big thing called racism that's standing in the way? That's why they were so aggressively anti-racist. They had to jump that hurdle if this ideology was going to work, and it was a significant hurdle. The other thing, and again, this is a dual-edged sword. I mentioned this before. You have an internationally based organization, right? That's good. You have resources. You have people watching this case worldwide. What's the problem? If you have central leadership in a place like, say, Moscow, that's dictating what the agenda of the Communist Party is going to be, what happens when that central leadership decides, nah, I don't think we're interested in Black folks anymore in terms of addressing these problems? That's not our thing anymore. Oops. And that's exactly what happened after the end of World War I. The Communist Party decided, hey, we're going to put our resources someplace else. We're going to put our resources toward rebuilding these countries that have been devastated as a result of World War I. So Black folks were kind of off the agenda, right? And that's the main reason why A. Philip Randolph, who was a socialist, couldn't really mesh with the Communist Party, didn't quite see eye to eye with the Communist Party. He couldn't abide giving up local control, right? The ability to set your own agenda and do things that the central leadership didn't necessarily think should be on the agenda. So those are some of my thoughts on that, and I do want to address some of your questions as well. And again, I'll take questions on this as well as the previous live stream. We do have one comment actually from Sounds of St. Elsewhere. Thanks for mentioning the existence of anarchists among the various forms of radicalism. Yes, in the early 20th century. Yeah, that's important because a lot of Black folks were, even though they couldn't necessarily say it overtly, because again, they had a lot of targets on their back, and do I really want to associate with these communists and radicals and anarchists? Of course, I mean, if we could go into the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which set a really chilling environment for Black folks, well, for radicals in general, and it really sort of I think largely kept Black folks from from joining even more radical organizations, because again, they were very harshly dealt with. But yeah, that was important. The Red Scare of 1919 had a really chilling effect on radicalism in general. And I think, despite the fact that the Communist Party was very aggressive in terms of reaching out to Black folks, probably kept a lot of Black folks from joining these more radical movements. Right? So it doesn't look like we have any more folks or questions in chat. I do want to thank you all for sharing this time with me, and I want to encourage you to continue to ask those questions. Again, these aren't questions that I necessarily have the answers to, but things that I think can be arrived at through discussion. And what do you think about this approach? What are the limitations of that approach? How do you deal with worker solidarity if we have this little thing called racism that's keeping poor white folks from wanting to claim solidarity with Black folks? These are real challenges and things that we're going to have to jump over if we're going to be effective in our struggles for liberation. So thank you so much for joining, and I hope you'll join me again next time. I expect to be back on in another 2 weeks or so. So till then, I'll see you in the comments.